The manhwa begins with our protagonist, who tells us that he is a scholar who writes, and wonders how his life would have been if he had not met that man and written about his life and martial arts. He then recounts that he met him a year ago at an inn, where we see the protagonist getting drunk due to failing the national scribe exam. He complains that the government favors those who have connections or money, and that the world will rot because of it. He continues to drink and starts shouting, which worries the innkeeper because there is a powerful person in the inn who might be annoyed by the noise. The protagonist continues to complain that the government official abused him and says that if nobody knows, it is as if it never happened. Then the man stands up. The innkeeper thinks he is going to hit the protagonist, but he just tells him that he wants to talk, but the protagonist must be sober first. The protagonist wakes up and sees that he is flying in the man's arms. The man stops and says that if he had not woken up, he would have thrown him into a waterfall. The protagonist warns him that what he did goes against the imperial law, but the man responds that it was the protagonist who was saying that the imperial law is unjust. He then throws a punch that destroys a rock and tells him that he should face the world with his strength. The protagonist realizes that he is not someone normal, and the man, named Sa Jahyuk, tells him that what he wants is for him to write a book about him so that what he did is not forgotten. He tells him that this way everyone will know about his adventures, and the protagonist asks him if he is still drunk. Jahyuk tells him that he will crush his knees if he opens his mouth without thinking again. Then we see Jahyuk and the protagonist return to the inn to sleep. There the protagonist tries to escape, but Jahyuk discovers him and says he is a coward. The protagonist responds that it is not wrong to bow your head to survive, but Jahyuk tells him that it is not true, because whoever bows their head will only learn to keep doing it. He also says that as long as he wants to, the protagonist will never be able to escape, and challenges him to try. He says he will let him run away or hide for 4 days while he stays at the inn, and after that time, he will come looking for him. The next day we see the protagonist and Jahyuk eating at separate tables. The protagonist gets up, thanks for the food, and tells the innkeeper that Jahyuk will stay for 4 more days. Then he goes out frustrated, and we see him running away in fear. He says he will abandon his original travel plan and take a carriage to another town, and then to a crowded city to be safe, while we see Jahyuk at the inn, who says he hasn't had this much fun in a long time. The protagonist runs to a carriage and asks to board. On the way, he overhears the passengers talking about how one of the great martial arts families, the Namgong, allied themselves with the merchants and took over the city the protagonist is heading to. Upon arrival in the city, the protagonist decides to explore the area, thinking it will be difficult for Jahyuk to find him. He visits the Tower of the Yellow Crane and recites a poem he wrote about it. A man tells him to be quiet, and the protagonist apologizes, but says it was harsh, which angers the man. The man is a martial artist and says the protagonist must take responsibility for his words. The woman with him says the protagonist is not wrong and should accept his advice, which makes the man even angrier. He says the protagonist will pay for humiliating someone from the Namgong family. His other companion tries to stop him, and the protagonist says it's against the law, but the man says he decides that. He attacks the protagonist, but a woman intervenes and saves him. The man asks her name, but she refuses to give it to someone like him. This angers him even more, and he attacks her again, but she blocks him, and his arm trembles with pain. The woman takes the initiative and attacks the man until he loses his sword. She sheathes her own sword and tells the protagonist to leave, while the man says it's not over. The protagonist thanks her, but she says she doesn't need it because she helped him because she thought he was someone else. She's about to ask if he's that person, but she stops and only tells him to be careful and not get involved with the warriors. The protagonist admits he was careless, and before she leaves, he asks for her name. She responds that he can call her Kang Ha Su Yun, and the protagonist thinks she's the one they call the Mist of the River. We see the protagonist eating at a restaurant when suddenly Namgong warriors arrive looking for him. He admits that he was the one who participated in the incident with the noble. They then ask where the woman is, but the protagonist says he doesn't know, so they arrest him and say they will take him until he remembers. The protagonist says it's against the law, but the soldier responds that he knows those who speak like him and that they shut up with a punch. Suddenly Jahyuk arrives without the warriors noticing. They tell him to let them go or he will become an enemy of the Namgong. But Jahyuk responds that that name does not scare him and paralyzes the soldiers with his energy. But when he is about to hit them, the protagonist stops him, saying that if he kills them, he will be just like them. Jahyuk asks if the protagonist will do what he says if he accepts his request. The protagonist responds no but says he is willing to listen to his story. Jaehyuk accepts, and the warriors leave. Both return to the inn, where Jaehyuk tells the protagonist that he is about to embark on his journey to Bimu, a fight to the death between the Muram warriors. The protagonist asks him how he will do it. Then Jaehyuk talks to him about the 4 stars of the Muram, masters who only care about defeating their enemies and moving up the ladder. And that is why he wants him to write his story, so that the truth of his battles will be remembered until his death. So, the protagonist agrees to try. We see the protagonist reciting the 3 characteristics of Confucius' path, while wondering which of the 3 he is not doing. Then we see the protagonist and Jaehyuk climbing a mountain, and he is surprised by the warrior's physical condition. Jaehyuk tells him that the key to improving his own is breathing, as well as maintaining concentration and taking steady steps without stopping. So the protagonist starts writing down the advice. There, Jaehyuk realizes that a great example is his calligraphy, as his flow while writing is firm and secure. They both return to the inn, and Jaehyuk tells the protagonist to go out again. They reach a cliff, where Jaehyuk draws his sword and begins to launch attacks in the air. So the protagonist says he has to write it down, but he realizes he can't because he doesn't understand it. Jaehyuk reveals the name of the techniques, but the protagonist says he couldn't see it clearly, so they go back inside. On the way back, the protagonist asks if it was okay that Jaehyuk showed him the techniques, as they are usually kept secret. And Jaehyuk tells him that there are still many more, but to see them clearly, he needs to understand the meaning of each movement. And he says that the protagonist lacks energy because he's hungry. Both arrive at a restaurant, and the protagonist tries to get a table, but is ignored. Until Jaehyuk appears, and the manager attends to them immediately. The protagonist understands that this is because Jaehyuk looks calm, while the warrior looks intimidating. So it makes more sense to attend to the second one, while the first one can be left waiting. But Jaehyuk says he's overthinking it, and that he can wait, since if an employee is rude, he just has to fix their attitude. However, he says that he's not worried about the employees, but the other people, and we see a group on the other side of the restaurant. The protagonist says they don't look like warriors, but Jaehyuk responds that he never said they were. At that moment we see the group, who realize that the protagonist and Jaehyuk are looking at them. A girl asks about the warrior's identity, and a boy responds that based on his sword he could be a man named Lee Hasan. But the woman says she doubts he's a registered person, as there's no information on such an impressive sword. They're afraid there are assassins coming after them, as they keep looking directly at them. And the man suggests that they could be mercenaries or undercover Shaolin monks, as their Kai energy is tremendous. Then, he seems to activate his energy, which goes directly towards Jaehyuk. But when it reaches him, he reflects it and destroys the man's glass, who says it's terrifying. The group asks for their opinion, and they realize that Jaehyuk directed his Kai without the others being able to feel anything, which should be impossible, and they wonder what kind of monster he is, while doubting they can beat him. And they say it's suspicious that someone normal like the protagonist is traveling with Jaehyuk. So the woman decides they will spend the night there since they provoked them, and ignoring a provocation is not their style. We see that Jaehyuk goes to find the protagonist during the night, and he wakes up thinking that the warrior would do so. They go out to train again, while the protagonist asks if it's necessary to do it every night. They arrive at the place, and the protagonist thinks that Jaehyuk is extraordinary. Seeing him is like looking at a mountain or a huge river. Jaehyuk then tells someone that it's time to come out, and the man from the group appears, apologizing for his rude behavior. But Jaehyuk points out someone else who is hiding, and then the woman and the boy also reveal themselves. Suddenly, the warrior launches an attack towards the protagonist, but hits the girl who is hiding behind him. The woman apologizes, saying that she was only doing her duty to face the protagonist, instead of someone powerful like him. Jaehyuk says that he doesn't like her, but the woman takes it as a compliment. Then, the warrior asks the man if he's ready, and he introduces himself as Gajin, who is honored to cross swords with him. Jaehyuk tells him to spare him the hypocritical words, but Gajin tells him that it's his genuine impression of him and that he won't hold back. Jaehyuk then communicates telepathically with the protagonist, asking him to calm his emotions and observe the flow. This calms the protagonist, who says that his confidence is unbreakable. Suddenly, Gajin jumps and attacks Jaehyuk, who receives the blow and repels him. Gajin attacks again from the air, using Jaehyuk's sword to jump once more. All the while, the protagonist is left with his mouth open, saying that he can't afford to look away for even a second. The protagonist says that it seems like Jaehyuk is being pushed back, but he doesn't feel like he's losing. Suddenly, Gajin finds an opening, but the warrior hits him with energy that repels him backward. Gajin asks if there's a way to enjoy the fight a little more, and Jaehyuk tells him that if he finds it fun, it's because all his opponents have been weak. Gajin is offended and asks if the disciples of the families and other opponents are weak then, to which the warrior responds that those are not places where strong people are found. This angers Gajin, and he attacks Jahyuk again. But then he feels that Jahyuk's sword is moving very slowly and realizes that he can't dodge it. We see that Jahyuk stopped before hitting Gajin and left him alive, who admits that he lost and thanks him for his words. The woman then thanks him too, but Jahyuk tells her to shut up. She asks if being the strongest under the heavens, the title of number 1, would be enough to apologize. But he says he's no longer interested in that title since being called that doesn't mean anything. She says he's right, and true power is to reign over others and have no comparison. To which he responds that people like her always think that way since they only give the title to a subordinate who bows to them. But he is different, and he cannot accept it because of the book he is writing. He tells her that if she is the queen of wolves, then live like one and don't dare to think about ascending to the sky. Then he tells the protagonist to leave if he's finished writing. The words of Jahyuk enrage the woman, who tells the boy to search for all the information about the warrior and the prota. She won't let it go since he said that despite knowing her identity, Jahyuk tells him that things will get tough for him from now on. We see the protagonist and Jahyuk traveling on a ship, and the warrior is dressed appropriately and without his sword. He explains to the protagonist that it's because they will pass by a naval outpost, and this way the soldiers won't aim their weapons at him immediately. The protagonist is surprised because he wouldn't want to go through by force, and Jahyuk tells him that it can't always be avoided since they don't live alone in the world. There's always a flow wherever they go, and those who disturb it are enemies. Then the protagonist starts thinking and deduces that Jahyuk is avoiding someone due to the route they took. The warrior admits that it's true since it's someone he can't defeat, which scares the protagonist, who notes that the atmosphere suddenly became tense and wonders who that person could be. Later, we see the protagonist searching through his notes about someone who could defeat Jahyuk, but finds nothing. He realizes everything he has written down, and remembers that Jahyuk scolded him because his words had become more elaborate when they should be simplified as he understands the movements better. The protagonist thinks he's right and wonders why Jahyuk wants to make his existence and battles known to the world. Later on, we see the protagonist walking through the city and then arriving at a forest where he suddenly encounters Nibla del Rio, but she passes him by and ignores him. In a scene change, we see the protagonist in a restaurant where he regrets not talking to her. Then his food arrives, along with Jahyuk, who tells him to eat a lot since it will be a complicated night, and the protagonist remembers that there will be a death duel. Both arrive at the dueling location, from where they can see the whole city. An old warrior appears and says he was afraid Jahyuk wouldn't keep his promise. He asks about the protagonist, to which Jahyuk replies that he's only there to write what he sees. Then the old man reveals his disciple, named Seorin. Jahyuk asks him if he respects the one who will kill his master, which angers Seorin. Jahyuk says he only gave clothes to a beast. The old man scolds Seorin and asks him to trust him, to which he agrees. The old man asks Jahyuk for permission to stay and observe the battle, as he wants to show him his moonlight sword. Jahyuk accepts, and the old man tells him that his sword is excited to see the warriors. He says they will begin their last bimu. Then they close the distance and begin the fight, where they both block each other's attacks. The old man says that Jahyuk hasn't changed and that he's still the only one his sword can't easily deal with. Jahyuk responds that he has changed, and that if he can't see it, it's because he doesn't want to believe it. Then the old man says that he defeated a boy with the title of the strongest under the heavens with his eyes closed, and that he wasn't even entertained, just like those who call themselves the strongest. But Jahyuk jumps and tells him that he's the only one blinded by his pride as he attacks him, and that men like him don't realize that there's always someone above them. And that's why they did that to him, while unleashing a great attack. The old man admits that they did something unforgivable because they realized they could never catch up to Jahyuk if he mastered the third moonlight strike. But he tells him that his excuses are rotting his ears, so they must end it. And Jahyuk prepares to deliver the first moonlight strike. And that's how the first part of this manhwa ends. If you've reached this part of the video, let me tell you that you've been one of the few people to make it this far, so comment the word erudite in the comments. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss any videos. With that said, see you in the next video.